everybody. I'm Karen Storwick, and I am welcoming you to this interesting discussion that we are about to have. I'm the Director of Communications for the Royal Alberta United Institute Services, and we have been hosting a speaker series, the Rocky Mountain Conference of Defense and Security. We're into our third year now, and we're very excited to have Sarah Chayes join us tonight. Before we move on to the introduction, I would just like to get a bit of housekeeping out of the way. What you can expect is a presentation, 20 to 30 minutes from Sarah, a formal presentation, and then we'll open it up for a Q&A following the presentation. Quentin Innes will be our moderator. Quentin will be introducing Sarah, and he will moderate the Q&A following the presentation. And how that will look is please feel free to write down any questions that you have in the chat box. You can raise your hand icon if you would like to ask a question. Quentin will see your question in the chat box and will call upon you. Just a reminder that this talk is being recorded, so if any of you are uncomfortable being recorded and you would prefer not to answer a question, you can indicate in the chat box that you would prefer if Quentin asks your question on your behalf. And the other thing I would say is that if we have a rousing discussion that seems to want to keep flowing after the top of the hour at 7 o'clock Mountain Time, we will just keep rolling until everybody has had a chance to ask their questions. But please feel free to drop off if you need to at 7 o'clock Mountain Time when the presentation is over. That'll be 9 o'clock Eastern for Sarah. And then the last thing I would say is that please remember to keep your mics muted during the presentation until the Q&A, and stay muted, please, unless you do have a question that you would like to come forward and ask. And we welcome a rousing discussion after the presentation, so we're looking forward to your questions. Quentin, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks very much, Karen. So as advertised, I'm Quentin Innes. I'll be moderating this evening. And I just want to introduce Sarah. Sarah and I go back, full disclosure, we go back almost 20 years. So I've known her for quite a while. Sarah Chayes is internationally recognized for her innovative thinking on corruption, especially its role in fueling security crises. Her 2015 book, Thieves of State, Why Corruption Threatens Global Security, has proven prescient. After living and working in Kandahar, Afghanistan for half a dozen years, she served as a special advisor to two commanders of the international forces in Kabul, and then to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the U.S. After Thieves of State, she turned her unflinching gaze closer to home in On Corruption in America and What is at Stake. Sarah now lives in Paw Paw, West Virginia. Sarah and I crossed paths in 2006, just before her first book, The Punishment of Virtue, was released. That book became required reading in 1 Brigade. Those of you who served in 1 Brigade at that time may remember it. And it was a key reference document for our planning in 2009 and later. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Sarah. Sarah, thanks very much for your time.
Thank you. It's really great to see you, Quentin. I wish it weren't, through a screen and everything. And thank you all. It's really something that people choose to gather, even in this way where they can't break bread together in the same room, to have discussions like this. I really appreciate all of you for being here, and obviously RAUSI and the staff for pulling off such a flawlessly organized event. So now I'm going to test that by sharing my screen. I think we can make this happen. You'll see the White House symbol up there. I'm not speaking for the White House, obviously. But I put it up there because this, according to a declaration by the White House, I think it was last year, fighting corruption is now considered a core national security interest of the United States. So things have changed since Quentin and I were talking about this 20 years ago, but still, I can imagine at least some of you saying, what? Corruption? national security? What are you even talking about? So allow me just to run through a couple of the current global security issues. Gaza. Let's just pause for a moment and consider, how has Netanyahu's corruption contributed to this current war? Just before the Hamas attacks, there were massive demonstrations to basically hijack the judiciary to prevent himself from being, tried and convicted of corruption. What about Mahmoud Abbas? Is it possible that the notorious corruption of the Palestinian Authority drove some people into the arms of Hamas? What about Ukraine? So on the right, you see the palace of Viktor Yanukovych, who was basically Putin's puppet. That is a way, having basically corrupting local leaders in the near abroad is a classic way, but not the only way, that Putin has instrumentalized, I would say, corruption as an element of state power. In the middle there, you see the Ukrainian soldiers back in 2014. Why do you suppose it was so easy for Russia to take over Crimea and Donbass, for example? The state of the army under Yanukovych's corrupt regime was beyond hollowed out. And then there's the story of how Putin basically promised his predecessor Yeltsin that he would not allow Yeltsin to be pursued legally for corruption. And then there's that place where Clinton and I met. From about that time, if not even going all the way back to about the first year I was there, it became clear to me that Afghans were distressed at the corruption of their own government, that they resented being shaken down by, for example, police officers wearing U.S. Army uniforms, right, in the street for money. And after a few years of honeymoon, my friends in Kandahar began just asking me, does the United States want the corruption? Why we weren't holding the Afghan government, which we were supporting financially and every other way, to some kind of account. And then there's the strictly military issue of why was it that, and I'll speak for the United States, why was it that the US was creating an army, a military in Afghanistan in its own image? That is to say, a military that required, large fixed bases, highly delicate, highly technologically advanced weapons that required the kind of maintenance, the kind of preservation from the elements that Afghans couldn't really easily supply themselves. I mean, it drove me crazy to hear that the Afghan military would be doing better with close air support. And I'm saying, wait a second, the Taliban don't need close air support. What's going on here? And so the question I began to ask is in whose interest was it to build that type of military? And all I had to do was sort of look around Washington, D.C. at the McMansions that ring the city, many of which belong to military contractors. So I would submit that represents that kind of capture of our military function by private enterprise through a constant exchange of personnel represents a kind of corruption. And then please, let's not forget, and I don't just mean climate, I mean the incredibly complex and increasingly delicate interconnection of biological processes that represent this irreplaceable planet that we are blessed to inhabit. And if you look at deforestation, if you look at overuse of fossil fuels, if you look at just about every environmental crisis, including parts per million CO2 in the atmosphere, and you dig a little bit, you'll find corruption. So, corruption, what do I mean? It's hard, which is one of the reasons it doesn't get addressed in places like Afghanistan. And I don't just mean a scandal, a single one-off event, right? That's often how we have to discuss it because of the sort of judicial framing, where you have to have a crime and a criminal and you have to have an event. But what I really mean is the operating system of sophisticated networks that, in effect, often masquerade as governments. All right. So that's a lot right there. Networks, what do I mean? I mean, first of all, in Kandahar, I discovered that the corrupt networks were vertically integrated. And by that, I mean that the so-called petty corruption that you would see on the streets, the police officers shaking people down, or even the teachers who would extort money in order to matriculate a student, doctors, pretty much every government official an ordinary Afghan encountered was going to ask them for a bribe or extort a bribe. Those officials did not keep all of that money. They would have to pay some of it up the line. And that amounted to quite a significant sum when it's the entire country, over the course of a year, between 2 and 5 billion US dollars a year, according to 2 different surveys way back in 2010. And in return, what went down that vertical chain was protection from repercussions. And that explains a lot of why some efforts to conduct anti-corruption arrests, even of so-called low-hanging fruit, were so unsuccessful, because President Karzai would intervene personally, even for someone who didn't seem that important, because that was the deal. And then I also mean that these networks are horizontally integrated. That is to say, we so often will think separately of, let's say, members of government. They were our allies in Afghanistan, but members of government supposedly representing the public. And then we think of private industry as a separate category. And then we think of out-and-out criminals as bad guys over there to be, classified with terrorists and whatnot. But these sophisticated networks interweave personnel from all 3 or even 4 sectors. And they often change places, right? So there's this expression here in the Washington, D.C. area, the revolving door, that a person will have a job in government and then later move to an even more lucrative industry that he or she was regulating. That implies that it's an individual thing where one single person pushes that revolving door. Another way of thinking of that is that this is how the network weaves its fabric, by constantly interchanging personnel among those 3 sectors of activity. Business, I would even include philanthropy, for example, government, and in cases, out-and-out criminal activity. So, how do you combat a dangerous network, right? How do you combat transnational organized crime? What policy options would you put on the table for something you consider to be a core national security interest? So I'm all for intelligence, right? Start by getting smart. Map the network. What you're looking at there on the left is a very schematic attempt that I made to visualize what I'm talking about here with respect to the country of Honduras. What's wrong about this image is that it implies that the network is a closed system located only in Honduras. And that was really an artifact of the graphic design, because it had taken so long to get this far, that we couldn't take apart the whole diagram and show that those lines extend across national borders. So, for example, the blue line was meant to represent the government. The green line, the private sector. The largest bank in Honduras is also the largest bank in Central America. Obviously, the red line, which is meant to represent the criminal sector, obviously, narcotics is a transnational business in Honduras. The little dots on the outside represent the sort of external, you might call them facilitators and enablers, who participate with and support these kleptocratic networks. And by that, I mean, banks, the secrecy jurisdictions, the people, the lawyers, the people who basically aren't actually members of the network, but support it, basically sell their services to it. So, and then again, when you're dealing with a sophisticated network, you have to think through, you have to recognize where it is, see what its most crucial nodes are. What are if there's an individual whose removal will really destabilize the network, then you focus your efforts on that individual, right? You seek vulnerabilities. And another problem with this slide is it doesn't show the money flow at all. It's important to know where are the key external sources of funding for networks like this. Don't forget things like international development assistance or development financing, which I took a hard look at in the case of Honduras. Things like climate finance, right? These networks position themselves to capture major revenue streams, including supposedly benevolent ones. Windows of opportunity, I think it's a really crucial concept, which I experienced, again, a little bit painfully in Afghanistan, because I would see, based on the calendar on the ground, that, for example, at a given moment, there was about a month in which you could influence President Karzai in a certain way. And then, I want to say, the interveners' calendars never seemed to line up with the calendars that were unfurling on the ground. So, windows of opportunity. There have been a number of important examples of windows of opportunity to really effectuate serious, thoroughgoing reform in a kleptocratic situation. So Afghanistan 2002, undoubtedly. The Arab Spring, Ukraine twice now, although the current situation is so dire that, as usual, the fact of war tends to eclipse the importance of corruption. But it was such a driving factor in the conflict to begin with that it would be a mistake to forget about corruption now. A couple others here, and Guatemala, which you see at the bottom, we'll go into a little bit more just in a few seconds. They're fleeting. I think it's basically 6 months. Afghanistan, I kept pushing it out. I stayed there for 10 years, so obviously I convinced myself somehow that this window of opportunity was still open, but it was certainly closed, in my view, by 2009. They are subject to fierce competition, right? I mean, kleptocratic networks do not take challenge lying down. They are extremely adroit at deploying countermoves. And that should be another part, I think, of the research upstream of intervening. What are the likely countermoves? What are the most dangerous and most likely scenarios? And how do you mitigate the risks? Very importantly, they are not solved by the mere removal of a head of state. We saw that in the Arab Spring. Not a single one of the Arab Spring countries really moved into a phase of serious reform. You can see what happened with Ukraine. And Guatemala prior to last summer is another excellent example, because there were actually two windows of opportunity in Guatemala, 2015 and last year. Therefore, if you've got only 6 months or a year, you can't address them with steady state action. You need intense effort, strategic thinking, creativity, afterburners, and a lot of agility, I want to say. So the Guatemala story, I just want to touch on it very briefly, because I don't think that the United States has been particularly good at addressing the issue of corruption in spite of the White House's declaration that we started with. But Guatemala in the last couple of months has been a remarkable exception. I'm not going to go through all of the details of the situation. You will be receiving, each of you, a copy of this slide deck when you receive the link to the video of this presentation. But essentially, you had an anti-corruption campaigner who won an election last August, and the kleptocratic network deployed every means to try to derail the possibility that he take power, down to, I think it was 2 hours before the inauguration, down to, after midnight, the day before his inauguration, before, his election was fully certified by the Guatemalan Congress. What happened in the interim was the United States imposed both global Magnitsky sanctions, which are applicable under U.S. law against for officials who have committed either human rights abuses or massive corruption, which is fairly new in the U.S. arsenal, against well-chosen individuals. So the kind of network mapping I'm talking about had obviously been done. And according to what I heard, against, for example, there were visa denials also. And granting visas is entirely a matter of discretion. And there is a provision of U.S. law that allows visas to be denied with cause. And so even family members of people in Congress who were obstructing the inauguration of President Arevalo were denied visas to enter the United States. And the other point that's crucial is there was a massive civil society kind of demonstration of support for the elected president, including basically a general strike. Indigenous peoples in Guatemala played a very important role. And that is what I just said is U.S. officials made really adroit use of some of the tools in their quiver, let's say. But last kind of adage that I would like to leave you with, Guatemala is important, right? I remember USAID, our Overseas Development Agency's administrator, was giving a speech about the important work USAID had done on corruption, and the example she chose was Moldova. Well, meanwhile, it seems to be a very key element of U.S. policy to try to induce MBS and Bibi Netanyahu to enter into an agreement that would result in the recognition of Israel by Saudi Arabia. You're looking at 2 of the most notoriously corrupt national leaders on the planet. There's something that doesn't really line up with this picture. It's just not credible to say that something is a core national security interest when you are almost thumbing your nose at it so demonstrably. So I think that when we identify something as a core national security interest, we have to treat it with commensurate seriousness. And that's really what I would like to leave you with this evening, is that this is not a nice to have. This is not an ancillary issue to be dealt with by in some lower reaches of a bureaucratic hierarchy. Corruption is central to every aspect of global security, and we ignore it at our peril. Thank you very much.
Sarah, thanks for that. That's excellent presentation and lots of food for thought. It's interesting that the U.S. government has actually identified the anti-corruption fight as a national security priority. I didn't know that, and that actually does lend us some hope here. I'm going to go out to the floor and see where we are. The first comment that came up was from Jason Dearborn, and Jason, I'm going to turn it over to you in a minute to ask your question, because I think there's a couple of questions in what you put in the chat. And it's actually quite apropos, because when I was in Kandahar in 2006, and people would start talking about corrupt Kandahari officials, I would say, well, hello there, how about the sponsorship scandal? And Sarah, if you don't know, sponsorship scandal was something we had in the 1990s, where the government at the time was basically washing taxpayers' money through a number of advertising agencies, which were then kicking it back to one of the political parties. So, Jason, with that little bit of a heads up, are you ready to formulate a question for Sarah?
Thank you for your presentation and the importance of this issue. I've been a provincial politician for a couple of terms in my much younger life. It's more than 20 years ago now. But I've also done international business for quite some time, and I've visited a number of these countries, and our corruption is one of the first things. Doing international business was checking the world corruption indexes for how we would interface in those sales processes. So I found that, historically, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, the Netherlands, we were very, very high. And so I had a couple questions on here. I'm going to do the second one first, if that's okay, because one of the things that was really interesting was that I used to use the CIA's World Corruption Index, and what I found was out of 100 deals, basically the number would show the number of problems that you had. So Canada was sitting, this was a lot of years ago now, but we'd be at 93. New Zealand would be at 94. We'd have 6 problems in 100 deals. You go to Kazakhstan, you've got 60 problems in 100 deals, right? And everything gets adjusted as much that way. But what was interesting was that the larger economies, the United States, Italy, France, Britain, they would never break that 80% barrier. And was there a reason and a correlation? I found that there was 3 direct kind of levels. There was a lot of religious overlap. Protestant Europe was on those, if you looked at where was less corrupt than Southern Europe, which was less corrupt than Orthodox Europe, which was less corrupt than the Muslim world. There was a big fall off if they had been a communist country. But it was always odd that the Germans, the British, the French, they had bigger economies. They had virtually the same culture that we did, but their corruption levels were higher, even the Japanese. And I was wondering if you know why that is, and is there a sweet spot? And that would be the second part. These underdeveloped countries that don't have, state infrastructures to support them, even, as local as Mexico, you get policemen taking bribes, which is not common in Canada or New Zealand or those places. So that's a couple things. I should let you speak first, and then we'll go back to the parliamentary system, and because these are really endemic, and I'm really glad that you're doing this. It is a national security issue that we're dealing with now in Canada. So please.
Thank you. Yeah, there's a lot there. I'm going to hazard something that seems to contradict something else that I believe. I do not believe that corruption is quote unquote cultural. It's fascinating how often I get that question, and that question only comes from basically Westerners. I've never had in Afghanistan, in, Serbia, in Uzbekistan, in Nepal, in Nigeria, never had an ordinary person that I'm talking about corruption with say, "Oh, Sarah, would you cut it out? That's just part of our culture. We don't mind." Never. That being said, the second book I wrote on this topic is called Thieves of State: Why Corruption Threatens Global Security. And for that book, I found myself looking historically. Interestingly, I looked at a lot of manuals for rulers, including a very famous one written for a Muslim ruler in about the 11th century, I think. And basically what it said, and I looked at The Prince, which is in fact a manual, and it's always presumed, we talk about Machiavellian, but Machiavelli and this author, this 11th century author, both said, essentially, you'll lose your kingdom if you're corrupt. If you mess with the property or the women of your subjects, that's the best way to fail as a prince. So I found that fascinating. But the other thing I looked at was the 95 Theses. So we're coming around to your point about Protestant countries. I urge all of you, when you get off this call, to just look up the 95 Theses, and you'll find about 83 of them are about corruption. The whole Protestant Reformation was really about corruption in the Catholic Church. And I'm not trying to deny the spiritual aspects of it or the democratization of access to God or anything like that, but it's pretty amazing how focused it is on material the system, the networked system of kleptocracy within the Catholic Church of the time. So that might have something to do with some of the differences you're talking about. But the other thing I would quickly add is, I mean, so many of the so-called corrupt developing countries that I've been to are having anti-corruption uprisings for levels of corruption that are, in my view, less consequential than those that exist in the United States today. So be careful about these indices, in particular doing business indices, because that's really focuses on bribery. Like when you talk about problems encountered, well, that's often problems encountered, because of an instability in the corrupt regime. In America, contract law is beautifully enforced. And I mean, we've got Swedish companies coming here to West Virginia because they can pollute in West Virginia and have their contracts respected. We're like a great developing country because the networked relationships between, in particular, polluting industries and the state government is so tight that that corruption is legal. That's really what I'm getting at, is corruption is legal. And if you're in the network, then of course you're not going to have any problems. But that doesn't mean that you're not actually participating in corruption.
Could you expand on that? Because you spoke earlier about it, and we know that it is a problem in the United States. I would say more so the revolving position between the regulatory industry and the private sector and governmental sector. But if you've read Kurzweil, the pace at which technology is changing and the pace at which government moves are diametrically opposed. And because of that, I have found that there's a secondary problem that the regulatory bodies themselves can impose a corruption in trying to retain a control relative to a legislative piece, which is not in any way relevant anymore because the technology has eclipsed it. And that you get an actual retarding corruption internal within a bureaucratic system. And that the bureaucracy, and it becomes much, much harder to navigate. And for the average citizen, in frankness, impossible. right?
So, and we should allow other people to have an opportunity to join the conversation.
Absolutely.
But I just want to say, be careful there in the sense that something that slows down doing business is not necessarily corrupt. If money is not being extorted for private gain, that's not corruption. You could call it inefficiency, but it's not identical to corruption.
There's always money involved because the bureaucrat is able to expand their jurisdiction. Hey, we've got this new thing, we've got to look at it. It's a organizational behavioral reality.
Yeah, but
right?
I don't think there's private gain in that. There's not necessarily private gain in that. But what I would say is here, that's not the problem. Here, the problem is that the regulators are being systematically underfunded and under-resourced so that in order to do anything, they actually go after small fish. So, you know, they might go after somebody in a motorboat on my little river here, because they just don't have the resources to go after the serious polluters. In the United States, that's much more of the problem. And I can understand that regulators make business people, you know, tear their hair out. I totally understand that. But I think that often what's happening is because the regulatory apparatus is for reasons of corruption being hollowed out and underfunded and under-resourced, who's really benefiting from that are the large corporations who are part of the network with elected officials. And I don't know if any of you have heard of my senator, Joe Manchin, who's been famous in the United States because he's the 50th Democratic senator, and he does not behave like a member of the Democratic Party. But in particular, he's not representing the voters of West Virginia. He's representing the fossil fuel interests in which he is heavily, heavily bought. And it's not only his political career that is financed by the fossil fuel industry, but his personal wealth is rooted in the fossil fuel industry. That's what I mean by networked legal corruption. Thank you very much for these thought-provoking questions. They're really good.
So, Jason, thanks very much for that. And we'll move along. Samuel has a question relative to culture. So how about and not the culture kind of, you know, different cultures have different levels of corruption or anything like that. But I think what he's talking about is the actual culture of corruption that could exist anywhere in the world. And that you've sort of so well described in West Virginia with Joe Manchin. So Samuel, with that introduction, I hope I'm not throwing you off, but I'll pass the mic to you.
Thank you. All right. You know the expression "money makes the world go round"? Of course, everybody knows it. That is not true. Psychology makes the world go round. There is not a person on this planet. I won't deny that money is a huge motivator for possibly most people. That being said, that's only a subset of psychology, which every single person on the planet has. People are conditioned, people are culturally raised to have the values that they do. And you can call me a simpleton, but there is a battle of good versus evil. There is. And when it's like, I forget what Native American tribe it is, but there's a proverb. It's the wolf you feed. That plays out on a social scale as well. And it's not unique to the United States. It's not unique to, it's universal. And unfortunately, we are entering unprecedented times in so many different ways, from population size to the technology that exists, and on and on and on. And it seemingly, I can probably say this with certainty, the momentum behind everything that is happening right now is the majority of it is being fueled by greed, evil, corruption that has been embedded and evolved historically over thousands of years to where we are right now. So you could talk about, you set a window of opportunity, so you can get to attack this one organization or attack, this politician or this party or whatever have you, right? But that won't solve the root problems. So I guess to ask my question, what are your thoughts on the cultural aspects which are culminating in the huge farrago in front of us?
So I think it's a great question, Samuel, and I would only disagree with you in one regard, which is you sort of describe a continuum from thousands of years ago to arrive today. And that's actually not how I see the historical, I want to say, health of corruption. I actually think, for example, the Protestant Reformation had a real impact on corruption within the cultures of the societies where it took place. And I took a closer look at this in my most recent book on corruption in America and what's at stake. And I found myself spending much more time and effort on the 19th and early 20th centuries than I expected I would, the so-called Gilded Age, and going a little bit later than that, because I was fascinated to discover that not only in the United States, but throughout the industrialized world, the same type of networked kleptocracy reigned. And something that I found very sobering was, and it's to your point, Samuel, was that it reigned not only regardless of political party in the United States, but regardless of political system. It was the same political economy that held sway in the United States, in England, which is a monarchy, in France, a republic, in Germany, an empire, a monarchy. I mean, a much more, even more autocratic monarchy than England was. Same political economic system. And then what happened? It basically drove a series of worldwide calamities. World War I, Spanish flu broke out then, the Great Depression, World War II. So you have two world wars, you've got two genocides, use of the nuclear bomb, let's add them up, right? And there's a lot of sociological research that shows that shared calamity tends to bring out altruism in people. There's all kinds of great research about how classes in England disappeared under the bombing. And I did a little study of President John F. Kennedy's father, and how he mishandled or couldn't really keep up with the changing ethos that happened in that period. And so as these calamities broke over the Western world, you had a kind of a change in ethical culture. You did. And it lasted about 40 years, where 40 years during which certain kinds of more egalitarian forms of, for example, labor reforms, but you also had civil rights, expansion of rights to different categories of human beings, even to nature to some extent. Our, earliest environmental legislation dates back to that period. So it's really interesting. And then starting about 1980, the pendulum starts swinging back again. And again, to your point, Sam, the role, yeah, sure, we all want more money. We all, want enough money to be comfortable and things like that. But during that period that I'm talking about, it wasn't fashionable to show off how much money you had. Money was not the universal yardstick for social standing. Often public office was. Often something that was more public spirited was held in higher regard by our communities than money was. But starting 1980, and here's where Reagan comes in culturally as well as politically. He was flaunting money all the time. And so money becomes the measure of social standing. And so long as that's the case, you're going to have corruption, because that's a race with no finish line. Quentin makes his first million, right? So I have to make 1,010,000, and then and you keep having to get ahead. There's no such thing as enough when money is no longer a means to achieve a certain dignity of life, but rather becomes your measure of social standing. And I'd like to just, sorry to do this, return to the prior question one moment about different parts of the world and talk about some of the developing countries that we see as so corrupt today. During this same Gilded Age was the height of colonialism. And how was colonialism perpetrated? It was perpetrated by corrupting, by the Western colonial powers, corrupting the local ruling elite. That is how colonialism was able to stay in place for so long. And so we do well to wonder why is it that these developing countries are so corrupt? Well, we implanted corruption in their governing structures. So sorry, that was something I had meant to say before.
Well, thank you. You actually just pointed to something though important. You said that they were corrupted, and as you said earlier, as long as there's money involved, and then if you're selling this notion that wealth is the metric by which we status, but at even a higher level than that, though, where there's a materialism versus spirituality.
Yeah.
And how do you at the very beginning of this discussion, you would one of your slides said strategy. How do you strategize to build spirituality in clout? I mean, up and down the pyramid, but especially in clout.
In clout?
Yes, clout.
I don't quite understand. How do you build spirituality in clout?
Yes.
How do you build its clout? Is that what you're saying?
No. How do you instill or here we are at our ages, right? Where we've been conditioned to forever, as long as we've been here. But even so, I'm not a fatalist, and I think with where there's a will, there's a way. How do you change the cultures that into those that value, not even just the culture, but the metaphysics that put spirituality above materialism?
So I'm not sure that I can give a prescription on spirituality. What I can say is that we all have the most sway with our own communities. So, and something my father once said that I've held close to my heart as a kind of adage is that I've tried to live by is let's hold our own communities up to their highest standards. So if you find your community, be it your family, be it your workplace, be it the institution you adhere to, be it whatever, elevating money above a core principle, challenge it. And you may not win. I've done this a couple of times and I've lost, but I still feel that there is value in surfacing the issue, in creating friction around. So I'm not sure I know how to elevate spirituality in a prescriptive way, but I do think I can try to put some brakes on the elevating of money ahead of every other consideration, at least within communities that I'm a member of.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, great discussion. Thank you very much for that. And so broadening the topic, we've moved from corruption to culture. We're now going to talk about the transnational aspect of this. And so LJ, can you come in and talk about your question about transnational core security interests, not just national?
I can. Thanks, Jason. Sarah, great to have you. Thank you very much for your time. Your first slide situated the issue of corruption as being the national security issue. And I would like to challenge that and say it is more than, or I will ask you rather, is it not more a transnational security issue that impacts not just the United States, but every sovereign? And if you buy into that, let's move from the abstract to the policy and practice without using the word hope or hopefully. I have some experience with the Financial Action Task Force set up by the G7 in late 80s, and they evolved into moving from money laundering generally to combating terrorism. And some academics will say that the FATF has enjoyed success at the margins. It's still there, but the issue is less than it would have been otherwise. I'll leave you with the question, is there a meaningful role for any similar intergovernmental organization to combat, if that's the correct word, corruption at its margins? Thank you.
So number one, I 100% agree with you that this is a transnational problem. The phrase that I put up on the first slide was taken from a White House declaration. So, of course, the White House was talking about United States national security. But in terms of someone who's interested in this problem, 100% it's a transnational problem. I do think that international cooperation, therefore, is absolutely crucial in order to address it. And money flows are an important way in, if you will. So international cooperation on tracing illicit money flows, all you'd have to do is expand FATF's mandate, and often these mandates are merely guidance provided by, if you will, the ambient culture, right? A friend of mine was a public prosecutor, was U.S. attorney in Kansas City, Missouri. And she explained to me when she worked on drugs, and then she, in the 90s, founded the bank fraud unit within her office. That was a brief moment when the U.S. really gave a damn about bank fraud. And so that's effectively corruption that she was looking into. But, she said, frankly, when President Bill Clinton came to office, that focus was relaxed. And then there was a little period where it was healthcare fraud, and then it was terrorism. And all of that is really about guidance provided by leaders in terms of how to direct the human and material resources of their institutions. So FATF could be, aimed at corrupt money flows just as much as it is currently aimed at terrorism. It depends on the priorities of people who give it guidance. And unfortunately, corruption has still not registered sufficiently. In my view, corruption is a much more dangerous factor in international security than terrorism is.
Well, then, a supplementary question, Quentin, then I'll shut up. Are we better to rephrase this debate as corruption is a threat to national security? An interest is, we all have interests, but threats may galvanize the political interests at a transnational level to varying degrees. And
if I had been in charge, if I had held the pen when that White House declaration was being written, I would have used the word threat. Again, the words that you are looking at are not my words. They're the words of the Biden administration. The Biden administration, I think, is doing better on this issue than prior U.S. administrations, certainly than its predecessor, but it's squishy. It's still pretty squishy, as my final slide suggested. You can't be serious about even a national security interest if you are flouting it so obviously by making, hand-holding of two kleptocrats central to your foreign policy. So yeah,
Well, one wonders how it might have played out with George Bush. But anyway, I'll turn the floor back to Quentin. Thank you very much.
Thanks, LJ. So your last comment, Sarah, is actually absolutely a great segue into our next question. So once again, realpolitik is going to raise its ugly head. And I'm going to let Karen Storwick take that one forward.
Thanks, Quentin. Yeah, I'm interested in your opinion if there is a relative scale of corrupt nations and global security is the goal. Is there ever a justification for lesser corrupt nations to support corrupt leadership for the sake of global security? And I'm thinking in particular here of what's going on with Israel and Hamas, because I struggle with this myself. Where do we put our support? And if Hamas is backed by Iran, which is backed by Russia, authoritarian dictatorships, and if Western democracy is, a lesser corrupt model, should we be supporting the Western democracy in spite of the fact that Netanyahu, as you say, is one of the most corrupt leaders in the world?
So I feel like there are two, in a way, separate issues there. I think your example has so many other elements to it than just corruption that that it's a difficult one to use to address your fundamental question. Your fundamental question, I would just say, it almost always comes back to bite us when we ignore corruption. And I know I've got some Afghanistan wiring there, but it was back, in 2006 when we met, right, Quentin, that I was already kind of talking about this. I wasn't quite as adamant as I became when I was working for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, but by then I was basically sure that if we don't address corruption, we're going to lose. And we did. I just didn't know. I mean, I knew by 2009, I knew that there was no way this was going to work because the population was so indignant at the way the government we were supporting was treating it that you couldn't ask them to take risks on behalf of that government. So it took a little while, but we lost. And I want to say similarly in the case of, there are a lot of other reasons why backing corrupt Netanyahu is also not, in my view, the right way to go with Gaza, because what hasn't made it into that example is the Palestinian population. I mean, there is another factor here other than corruption, which is what happens to the 2 million people who are caught up in this. But again, let's back it up a little bit and say the corruption of the Palestinian Authority was kind of ignored. And in fact, it was probably reinforced, including maybe by democracies that were supporting it as a potential partner in a two-state solution. And I want to say the kind of unwavering support of Netanyahu also is part of what drove Hamas to the extreme that it went. In other words, when you have a corrupt option that occupies the space for civic resolution of this conflict, that is to say, the Palestinian Authority, on the one hand, and on the other hand, where you have a corrupt leader who enjoys blind support on the part of the most powerful nation in the world, what recourse do ordinary Palestinians have? Which way can they turn? People, and this is what I really explored in Thieves of State, people denied any avenue of civic recourse will resort to extremes. The Protestant Reformation was not pretty. It was extremely violent, extremely extreme. People pushed statues out of windows. It was very ugly. And so on some level, I would say this closing off of any civic recourse for Palestinian citizens drove them to a minority support for Hamas, which led to where we are today. I just don't think in the long run, support for systemically corrupt regimes pays off. Now, what I will say is that there's a difference between unflinching, unwavering, blank check support on the one hand, and we won't work with them on the other. I think that's the dichotomy that we often feel ourselves to be presented with. And I would just say there were 18 different ways that the U.S. could have handled the Israeli response to the Hamas attack that fell short of that the U.S. administration is beginning to examine now, beginning to explore tentatively now. But why is U.S. support unconditional? Why do you not modulate and modify the ways that you work with corrupt regimes? Why does it have to be all or nothing?
It seems to me that that Biden is looking at it maybe as moves on a chessboard, that he doesn't want to make any indication that he might be supporting a regime that Russia is supporting. It's almost back to the Cold War superpowers again, that it's either us or it's them, and there is no in between.
I think that's possible. I think also you should never underestimate a U.S. president's weather eye to an upcoming election. I also think that Biden has a personal history with Israel. He's been personally very all in for Israel, and I'm not quite sure where that comes from. And I'm not positive that I see as close a connection between Russia and Hamas as you do, but you may well know a lot more than I do about that.
Well, thank you, Sarah. I'm going to
Thank you.
turn the floor over to the next question.
Okay, so next up is Mark Bretherton. And Mark has got a specific example of regulatory capture specific to Canada. But the larger question there is, at what point are we justified in calling the kettle black, I guess? Mark?
Well, hi, guys. This is fascinating. This is the first time I've actually had a chance to attend one of these lectures, and this is brilliant. This is right up my street. I'll give you a bit of a background to me. I'm from Britain originally, and where I served in the British Army in Northern Ireland, and I saw a fair amount of the conflict there. I was a bomb disposal technician in Royal Engineers.
Wow.
So I came to Canada in the hope that this was going to be this great, fantastic, beautiful land, and it was going to be free of all the ills and sins and vices that I'd seen in the UK and Northern Ireland in the sectarian war that I'd seen there. Oh, and I began working for a large corporation here. And I won't mention its name because this is being recorded. And they're probably watching me, watching you, watching. And I'm not even kidding about that. But what I will say is it involves the
They got right on you, Mark.
Yeah.
yeah. So
I think
Yeah,
so.
let's come back to
Mark, we'll move on and we'll come back to you. So, Khalid Ferdows has a question about corruption in Afghanistan and the influence of sort of Western mores and Western ways of doing business on how that corruption played out. So, Khalid, I'll turn over to you. So, Khalid, Khalid's comment was in Afghanistan, most of the corruption led by the president's office, ministers and deputy ministers and directors. And he said the majority of them were Western educated, but the regular Afghan was not involved in corruption, which I think sort of speaks back to your observation that the average Afghan was very resentful of the degree of corruption they saw. And it speaks to that sort of vertical integration that you described. So can you talk a little more about that?
Yeah, I would contest that point a little bit because I just saw it at every level, every single level, district chief's offices down to the local police officer. But I would also say that it was vertically integrated. It was very difficult, for example, to be in the police without being corrupt because you often had to purchase your position. And that meant that you were then paying off the purchase price and you were also having to pay a cut of whatever you were taking from people. So public office therefore attracted, either it forced people to be corrupt, and I remember a Nigerian telling me that this system is corrupt and corrupting, that his government system was corrupt and corrupting. And I think the same was very much true of Afghanistan. So it either obligated people to be corrupt or it enticed and rewarded the opportunists who were motivated by this kind of race with no finish line for more and more money, which was providing some degree of social standing in Afghanistan too. So I agree largely with the thrust of that question. And I would say that money as a mark of social standing was definitely a Western import. I don't think that existed in Afghanistan certainly prior to the Soviet invasion. I mean, without 100% letting Karzai and company off the hook, without neglecting to acknowledge that there was corruption spread throughout all layers of society, I am definitely willing to shoulder a lot of the blame on behalf of the West.
And I can give you a specific example to that, which is the chief of police at Kandahar Airport. So that position was almost it's almost like a franchise operation where the chief of police would skim taxes, service charges, whatever, and then would pass those up through his chain. So it's almost like he purchased that position and then he used that position to create money. But part of his purchasing the position was paying fees back to the people who got on the position. So it was pretty complete there. Mark, are you back on?
And in return, he got protection from on high, right?
Yeah. The reason I found out about this is because when we tried to remove him, he was gone for 2 weeks. He went to Kabul and he came back again. All of a sudden, he was back in as the guy. So yeah, it's pretty. The interesting thing was the degree of integration between the governance structures and what we perceived as either the drug dealers, the drug lords, or even the Taliban. So guys that we thought would be, sort of working Taliban issues, turned out that they were protected because they were paying off somebody in Kabul.
or they were woven into that person's network. They were their son-in-law. They were, there was a lot of that too. It can be family relationships. It can be fought side by side on this, with the Mujahideen or with the government. I mean, those types of social network ties end up being crucial in cases of network kleptocracy. And you also see we're talking about Afghanistan. Look at all of the roles of different Karzai brothers and in-laws and stuff like that. And then, look at the Trump family, look at the Aliyevs in Azerbaijan. Look, it's just in Angola, you very often see, just as in cases of organized crime, you see family networks or family groupings at the core of these kleptocratic networks.
Yeah, a great example was a connection between the Akinzada family, the Norzai clan, and the Karzai family, which we can talk at length if somebody wants to talk about it afterwards. Okay, I think Mark is back up. Mark, can we bounce back?
Great. Yep.
Well, isn't that great?
That was priceless, Mark.
Well, at the exact moment I was talking about, they're watching me, watching you, that's when my internet quit. So, this shows I'm not all that paranoid. Anyway, onto the question, as you were, so I would like to inquire about if, and I have seen what I consider to be forms of corruption here, and they're quite overt, and they do involve large amounts of money, not necessarily in brown envelopes at midnight, but in stock options and in dividends, etc.
Exactly.
But what I'm seeing here in Canada is for Transport Canada, seems to be run by officials who used to work for the railway and vice versa. As you were saying before Washington there about the spinning door or revolving door, and it's the same here. And what I would ask you to sort of make a comment on is that in terms of a threat to national security, I've seen all manner, and I've been involved in all manner of disasters on the railway, involving, back in 2013, an entire town in Quebec was burned to the ground with no public inquiry and without any proper inquest. And more recently, in the last 5 years, I've had 4 friends who've been killed in the workplace. 3 of those deaths are under RCMP investigation, and they have been for 4 years, and there's still no inquest, and there's still no conclusion to these investigations. They seem to be endless. And to me, this is corruption. This involves millions and millions of dollars. I'll just finish up my point here, is that in the same year in which 4 men were killed here in Calgary alone, our president and the CEO received a safety bonus for $380,000. And how do we fix corruption abroad in Afghanistan or anywhere else when our own system is rife with it? That's the question I have for you.
Well, I just applaud the question. So another example is the 737 MAX.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. It's the regulatory capture there is so shocking. There's finally being a little bit of inquest, but basically Boeing inspects itself. It's absurd. Mm-hmm. And that was what I was saying earlier when I can't remember the name of the gentleman that I disagreed with him when he said there's basically too much regulation and regulation is slowing everything down. In my view, as in yours, I think, the opposite is the case. There's real regulatory capture, and the same goes. So what about 2008? Has anybody done an excess death study in Canada for the year, let's say 2009, 2010? In the United States, it seems that as many people died from suicide because of the Great Recession as were killed in 9/11. That's deaths. let's think about the destabilization of the entire economies of our countries that took, decade or more to begin to repair, that probably stoked some of the political extremism that at least this country is suffering from. Well, that was due to the same kind of regulatory capture you're talking about. And if the revolving door between the transport agencies of our two countries and the railroads or Boeing is breathtaking, just take a look at the revolving door between Wall Street and the US Treasury and the US Federal Reserve. So indulge me in another story. Last year, the US Department of Justice was very proud of having nabbed a fraudster, a scam, organization that stole 180 or something like that $1 million worth of COVID relief money. It was supposedly supporting feeding centers for children whose parents were out of work because of COVID, blah, blah, blah. But in fact, there were no such feeding centers, and they sent, millions of dollars, of course, to Africa, right? They were Kenyans. So the US DOJ is very proud of having nabbed this. Meanwhile, $500 billion of United States taxpayer money was transferred to the Federal Reserve in order to purchase bonds on the market in order to keep, liquidity and all of that going. So why were US companies in so much debt during those early days of COVID? Not because of COVID, because they had been buying back their own stocks in order to inflate the value of their stock. It's called, it's a stock buyback. So that's why there was a credit disaster or credit crisis on Wall Street. So what does the New York Federal Reserve do? It apparently is not capable of buying bonds. It doesn't have the internal expertise for some reason to purchase bonds. Therefore, it puts out, it is going to sign a contract with a private company to do its bond buying for it. Who does it sign a contract with? Well, no, but the Federal Reserve does not sign that contract. The Federal Reserve establishes a private company, an LLC, in guess what state? Delaware, which is the largest secrecy jurisdiction on the planet. So my public institution of the Federal Reserve creates a private company. Therefore, I, as a taxpayer, cannot see any of the doings of that company. I can't see the contract. I can't see any minutes of any meetings. It's secret. In a secrecy jurisdiction, that private company signs a no-bid contract with BlackRock, which is the biggest money manager in America. No-bid contract. To spend $500 billion of my money. All of this went completely uncommented on, right? And if you look at the revolving door between BlackRock, the Treasury, and the Fed, I mean, it's a superhighway. It is a constant exchange of personnel. That's corruption. That's what you're talking about, and that's corruption. And that is such a significant international security threat of a different type than former military personnel are used to thinking about. Even former cops. I had a long debate with a former city chief of police who was telling me that he had spent his life addressing the kind of crime that really affects people's lives, meaning street crime. And after, hours of conversation, he finally did acknowledge that 2008, that fraud, bank fraud, affects ordinary people's life. But it again, we're talking culture here. You have to really rearrange people's mindset to get them to think about bank fraud as an international security threat.
Hey, and I think with the comment on networks and this revolving door you're talking about, I think we can bounce back to Jason for a question about mathematical models.
Oh boy.
Templates. So the idea being the creating or mapping the networks. And I think that's what Jason's getting at. Jason, I'll pass it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. I mean, this is really important, but it's massively complex. Every one of these issues that's been raised by, these very well-spoken people, they're complex issues. So, um, complexity is often well served with mathematical models. And I work in networks myself, in blockchain networks, and so there's a lot of stuff becomes revealed in those processes. And so, if you were able to, are there mathematical network applications or algorithmic templates that can be put forth to say, okay, we're going to look at the money in this public spending entity, and you hit this variable, you hit this variable, you hit this variable, and the coefficient moves this much. And you should really look at this, because a mathematical smell test, I simply don't know. You're an expert in the space, and I was hoping you could address that. Thank you.
You're welcome, Jason. I'm not that good at actually doing that type of digging, but I do know that there are big data applications, not so much templates as applications, that, for example, can develop and identify social networks based on scraping of social media. Obviously, if one has access to signals intelligence, telephone connections, that's how often Taliban, that's how I started thinking about network mapping, in fact, was looking at network diagrams developed by intelligence officers in Afghanistan. And I started thinking, wow, we need to apply this, not just to the Taliban, but to the integrated networks that were operating there. And since those days, 20 years ago, the types of applications and tools that you're talking about are much, much more sophisticated, including the ability to put together money flows and including the ability to scrape social media and whatnot. I would still put in a word for old-fashioned human. I think it's hard to... These algorithmic applications, I think, are a great start, and they can do massively more work than individuals can analog. But it's important to kind of gut check them again, or reality check them against on the ground, I want to say, almost intangible knowledge. But that's a really excellent point. And I suspect that the diagram that I showed in the slide was generated with the help of the type of applications that you're talking about. Each of those dots represents an individual.
Yeah, I thank you very much for that, because my primary concern, I'm just reading a book called The Mosaic Effect right now, which is about hybrid warfare against the United States by the Communist Party of China infiltrating the Canadian political system. I worked for the Chinese for 2 years, and when I read it, it's on a whole different level, because I recognize, oh my God, that's exactly what they're talking about, right? And we were in the Globe and Mail, which is our national newspaper, for better or worse, and it was a food security issue. And one of the massive problems that we have is, the oversight of, and I don't think it's a matter of money. I think it's a matter of well, I think we don't know what we don't know. And there's no way to be watching. I was in front of the House of Commons Standing Committee on banking and finance on money laundering in Canada. And we're one of the worst places in the world. And it's essentially Vancouver, Toronto. And the reason for this is we're a safe haven. And secondly, 1 in 4 Canadians owns bank stock directly or indirectly. And if you don't have our false economy is a real estate driven economy, which means you have to have more people coming in. We don't have the birth rate. I'm pro-immigrant, but we're at a point where people in Vancouver that have been multi-generational will never own a house there. And it's because this is a safe landing. And yet we don't have mechanisms to be able to, as either public figures or private figures or even the academic world, saying, hey, you got to apply this model, and hence it just leaks and bleeds. And what you're talking about is very, very important. And I was hoping that there are some technical aspects that could be put into place that we could point to. Our RCMP, CSIS, all these groups are completely useless. And not a little bit, I mean, shamefully so.
Though, I mean, I do think that technology can assist in the investigative and intelligence sides of this, but without, again, back to the very beginning of the conversation this evening, without a cultural shift to where integrity is the highest standard, or at least a high standard, these tools are not going to be applied. We can't outsource our ethics, our principles to technology. So again, for example, when in 2020, when the Biden administration came into power and the Democratic Party controlled both houses of the U.S. Congress, there was going to be a big new bill that was going to supposedly reverse a lot of the corruption that had been allowed to flourish under the Trump administration. But the ethics component fell out immediately. So the sort of voting aspects of it stayed in the bill, which didn't end up passing, both houses anyway. But instantaneously, the ethical standards as applied to the Congress of the United States, congressmen and women were delighted to free themselves of any ethical standards. The Supreme Court of the United States is the same way. I mean, a number of scandals have been brought to light in the last number of months. They still don't even have a code of ethics, let alone anything that would be binding. So if we don't have the mettle to impose standards of integrity on ourselves, if our leadership does not, then no technological gizmo is going to do it for us. And so
your conclusion then is I believe we're in the start of the Third World War. Is this an inevitability that we must go through this multi-generational point of suffering and collective experience to realign?
Oh, Jason, I would
I love America.
You hadn't asked me that question.
I love America, but North Carolina has congressional districts that are not even contiguous. Like, you guys aren't even trying anymore. and I mean, like, not that we're an embarrassment internationally ourselves now, but
here's what I want to say is that last time around, it took multi-generational trauma to buy us 40 years of respite. We are currently on the same trajectory. I was shocked at how similar the trajectory that we are on today is to the trajectory that we were all on between 1870 and 1935. I don't personally, you asked me a question, I'm going to answer it. I don't personally see any evidence that we have what it takes to divert the train off of the tracks that it's currently on. So personally, I would not be surprised if multi-generational calamity does not lie in store for us. And that's why I'm speaking here tonight. Like, that's why I really think this thing is super urgent. I think we are, yeah. I mean, that's my answer.
Thank you. I think your insight is terrifying.
And thank you for that, Jason. Thanks for bringing that one up. And I think what you're talking to is kind of the the difficulty of doing a cultural shift. And typically, if you look at organizations that have had to shift culture, that cultural shift is usually the result of a near-death experience. So you can see it in corporations, you can see it in civilizations, you can see it in culture writ large. So, Sarah, I'm aware that we're sort of half an hour over your time. Do you want to take one more question?
I know that's true, but I want to come in behind what you just said because I think it's incredibly profound. And I would go beyond. So you're right. Let's think of us personally. When did you execute a major transformation in yourself? Did you just do it gently, or was there some crisis? Did you lose a job? Did you divorce? Did you have a serious illness? It's true of individuals. It's true of countries and societies. I would even go on to say it's true evolutionarily. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of Stephen Jay Gould. He was an evolutionary biologist who really caused scientists to realize that evolution was not this nice, steady curve that I think a number of us were kind of learned in school, but rather was the result of what he called punctuated equilibrium, which is to say crisis, dramatic change in speciation, and then a relatively steady state. The Earth geologically functions that way. It has a pulse of massive amounts of geological activity every 27.5 million years. I was writing geology before I came on tonight, so the fact that you said that, Glenn, is really amazing. And so on some level, I'm tempted to say crisis, transformation, and calm is in a way the impulsion that makes the world go round, that makes the universe function. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to avoid, given that we are blessed with intelligence, or a certain type of intelligence, a certain type of foresight, couldn't we please use it as Jason is asking us to in order to soften the blow? I wish we could.
A great summary, Sarah. I want to give the last question or the floor at the end to Stuart Campbell, because he came up with an interesting Canadian example. SNC-Lavalin, Bombardier, and what I would call Quebec Incorporated.
Yeah.
And it speaks to your point about cultures having difficulty changing unless there's a very definite reason for them to change. So Stuart, I'll hand it over to you.
So yeah, we all talk about corruption overseas, and we all understand what's happened in Israel, how Israel came to be, and all the objections they received from Muslim states, Iran backing them, and Putin backing Iran. But the same thing's happening at home, where it's being swept under the rug. And you talk about SNC-Lavalin, Bombardier, Quebecor, and I'm sure there's countless other ones. I'm sure if you look at the Port of Montreal, all the stolen vehicles going out, there's got to be some level of corruption going on in that port as well. Will we ever find out? I'm just wondering, is that all politically motivated? Because a lot of that activity seems to be happening in the Quebec region. And of course, liberals, conservatives, they need votes. I get that. That's my assumption. That is being driven by politics, which equals power, which equals money. What's your take on that?
You know, I'm afraid that may be a little bit too detailed a Canadian question for me to answer. I just don't know enough about the specific interaction and Quebec as a province and its political economy to be able to give you a good answer to that. What I would say more broadly is that I think there's often a question arises as to whether money is used by the corrupt to gain power or whether power is used to gain money. And of course, I think there's often a bit of both. But there again, we come into the cultural context. And in a period or within a cultural context in which money is the primary yardstick of social standing, then you will find, I think, cases that the vector goes more in the direction of people seeking power in order to monetize it, people seeking power in order to gain money. But during those periods when public office is a marker of social standing, or the exercise of power is somehow desired either socially or personally, because we had the mention earlier of psychology. Let's not forget the role of pure narcissism, of pure, people who are insecure, gravitating toward the exercise of power to make themselves feel dominant or in control or in power. There is a personal dynamic to that also. But so in those cases, and in cases where public office is a marker of social standing, then you will more often see money used to gain power. So back to my Kennedy example, Joe Kennedy, Joe Kennedy, the father of John F. Kennedy, who was a very powerful, very rich businessman, and also almost certainly had, let's say, interweavings with organized crime in this country, probably spent money to obtain I can't remember if it was in the primaries or in the general election, the votes of this state, West Virginia, is one classic example. So that was a case of money for power. But I really don't feel qualified to speak specifically to the case that you mentioned.
Okay.
But I definitely agree, as I think I've been making clear, that this issue is not just over there. This issue is central to the health of Canadian and American democracies and to the security of our citizens and the health of our landscapes.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, Sarah, I think we can wrap it up there. Thank you so much for your presentation. I think it was an outstanding discussion on this. And I think we've brought it home with the idea that it's important to all of us. And over to you.
Over to me. I was just replying to someone on Netanyahu. I'll send this by chat. But I just can't thank you all enough for also, I want to say, meeting this discussion on the terrain that I think it deserves, is a little bit outside of, let's say, the nuts and bolts of military security, which is kind of where I started it based on the organization that you are, and taking it onto this deeper terrain that I think really does need to preoccupy all of us as citizens, as well as people who are concerned with national and international security. So I thank you very warmly. And again, I'd really like to extend my thanks to the entire team at RAUSI.
Thank you. And Karen, I'll pass it back to you for closeout.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sarah, for a fascinating evening. I know we were all really looking forward to it. It certainly didn't disappoint. It's just been great to have you with us tonight. And please, everybody, if you have a chance, if you haven't already, please take out a RAUSI membership. It's only $10 at the moment. And so it's a great deal for supporting an organization that is encouraging these kinds of discussions. And do join us again on May the 9th when we will welcome Romeo Dallaire for a discussion.
Oh, wow.
Which promises to be interesting as well.
There.
So
Yep.
Thank you so much for joining us. We had a good crowd, and I would say the vast majority stayed right through the full hour and a half. And so really pleased for everybody to stay tuned and to participate in the way that you have. Thank you so much for a great discussion.
I've put my email address in the chat because I saw that there may have been quite a few further questions. So if anyone cares to connect with me offline, you're welcome to.
That's wonderful. Thank you for that.